Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview, powered by SIG, and I'm your host, Philip Eidson. And today's show is part of a mini-series of 6 different episodes that I recorded all live at the recent SIG Fall Summit. And this being a live recording, you'll be sure to hear some background noises from baristas making coffee to venue employees taping wire to the carpet. Lots of different little noises in between. We actually had a booth set up in the main corridor of the conference venue, so you're sure to get the atmosphere from the event from those interviews. And so for this mini-series, I'm actually going to jump straight into the conversation. You'll hear me introduce the guest as we get going with the conversation. So with that being said, let's roll the tape. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview. I'm joined by Chris Camejo, the Director of Product Management for Threat Intelligence at NTT Security. Sounds like a scary title. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
And we're here at the SIG Fall Summit in Carlsbad, so I'm delighted we were able to do this and do a face-to-face interview. It makes so much difference. I have to ask to start the conversation, what exactly is threat intelligence?
So it's basically spying on the bad people. We're taking a look at all these various bits and pieces of what bad people, hackers, are up to. And that could be taking a look at their viruses, their malware, taking it apart to see what makes it tick and how we can defend against it. That means looking at their tactics, how they operate, how they typically break into an organization. Do they send a phishing email first and use that to get the malware in and then penetrate the network? And then going out and looking at their communication channels. So a lot of these people have these sort of underground forums that they communicate with each other on. They share tips and tricks. They talk about their plans. If somebody steals a bunch of credit card numbers, they need to sell it. Yeah. So there's forums where they sell all of this.
It's like the dark web.
Exactly. And so it's about being in the right places to keep tabs on them and see what they're up to, see if they're planning an attack, see if there's a new tool out there, and basically just helping our clients be prepared to defend against whatever's coming next, and to give them early warning if maybe they've already been hit and maybe a bunch of their clients' credit card numbers just showed up.
Unbeknownst to them, but they're now being hawked on the market.
Exactly, and that's unfortunately how a majority of breaches are found out, is not because the victim detects the breach on their network. It's because somebody else calls them up and tells them, hey, we see a bunch of data that we think belongs to you in a place that it doesn't belong. And that's not the right way to find out about these things.
No. There's no red button that starts flashing when somebody hacks into your system.
Right, and if there is, sometimes, again, sadly enough, it gets ignored.
Yeah. So what are the biggest threats that companies actually face today?
It depends on what industry they're in. One of the big things we hear all the time is, I don't have anything that anybody would want. It won't happen to me. But it comes down to money. Yeah. Everyone has money. And it may not be credit card numbers. It may be just the money in your corporate bank account that somebody wants to try to wire out to somewhere. And so that's the big thing for any organization, no matter how big, how small, what vertical they're in. They've got money somewhere that somebody wants to try to get. And so that's one of the big threats we see, is just people directly going for that money. There's a lot of what we call banking malware that gets on your computers and basically waits for somebody to type in the password to your bank account so that the hacker can now go into your bank account using that password that they saw and transfer it all out. Phishing emails, something we call business email compromise, or my more favored term for it is CEO fraud, where somebody will send an email to the finance personnel that's forged. It looks like it's coming from the CEO or the CFO, and says, we're doing a merger and acquisition. This is super secret. You can't tell anyone about this, but we need you to transfer $1.5 million to this particular account to complete the buyout of whatever we're doing. And people fall for this. People fall for this in big ways sometimes.
I guess when you think about people who do fall for that, you take a step back and you think, how is that even possible? But then you put yourself into their worlds when it's one of 300 emails that they receive today, and you just kind of react to something without necessarily thinking about it.
Yeah, and it very much depends on corporate culture. A lot of people think about information security in the context of IT, that it's all about computers and bits and bytes, but in reality, there's a lot of process to this. And when we talk about something like these email compromises, it comes down to what sort of corporate culture do they have? Do the finance personnel have a process that they must follow every time for approvals of these sorts of requests? Or is somebody just going to see an email from the CEO and say, oh, well, the CEO told me to do it, so I'm going to do it, and completely do an end run around all of their processes that are supposedly in place? And that's the underlying problem, is when you have the company with these sort of, shall we say, aggressive executives that must get things immediately their way. That kind of sets them up for failure when
there's no questions asked.
Right, exactly. And you want to have that sort of questioning culture that if something strange is happening, you want your person in finance to be able to pick up the phone and call the CEO and say, hey, was this really you? Right. Did you really mean this? Are these dollar figures correct? Is this account number correct? Because without that, no amount of computer security is going to help you when the person isn't following the process.
Right. What are some of the emerging threats that you see that perhaps companies just aren't seeing yet, or maybe organizations are a little bit slow to see? Because when I think about risk, we often think about the geopolitical risks or weather-related risks, things that are a little bit more tangible. We don't necessarily think about things that we can't see because we don't necessarily understand them.
Yep. A lot of what we're seeing is going into what many people will probably be aware of at this point is the Internet of Things. All of the the connected thermostats and cameras and all of that. We saw the big attack last year with the Mirai botnet that was based on the attackers just taking over a whole bunch of internet-connected video cameras and using them to then launch other attacks. And that's the big thing, again, coming back to that, it won't happen to me. I don't have anything that somebody wants. Well, you've got computers on your network. Those are resources that someone else can use. Maybe they're not directly attacking you, but they're using your resources to attack someone
computing
else.
Power.
Exactly. And that's what all these cameras were about. They were simply computers attached to the internet that could be used to launch another attack.
Interesting.
And so that's part of it is the fact that your organization could become sort of, I don't want to say complicit, but a tool that's used to attack someone else. And then another big piece of that with the resources is cryptocurrency is huge. A lot of people have probably heard about Bitcoin by now. And sort of without getting into the weeds of Bitcoin, one of the things that is a moneymaker there is what's called mining, which is sort of like almost like acting like the bank. It's sort of peer-to-peer banking, and the people that run and keep the ledger can actually make a profit doing so. And that takes computer resources to maintain that ledger. It's designed to take a lot of computing resources.
Because they're creating the cryptocurrency, right? Through that mining process is to create currency, essentially.
So it's a lot of number crunching. And that's another big thing that we're seeing now is taking over other organizations' computers simply for the purpose of running this mining software. So now your computers are running at 100% power all the time because they're making money for somebody else essentially. They're doing somebody else's work for them. So that's another big one. And then sort of the third-party risk that we see a lot with sort of the risk to infrastructure. And this is when you get into more of the geopolitical space that what happened in the Ukraine a few years ago with, Russia and the Ukraine, they're not the best of friends right now. Other countries as well, like Georgia and Estonia, that there have been some sort of political things happening in Eastern Europe, and we've seen attacks on the banking system, the media, and the power grid as a result of those geopolitical frictions in Eastern Europe. And that's the kind of thing that, sure, the power plants may be the target for whatever political reasons are going on, but what about all of the companies that rely on those power plants to run their factories and everything else? And so now you're in the situation where the attack may not be directly targeting your business, but because this other third party that you rely on gets knocked out, your business gets knocked out as well. And so your own information security and all of your protocols don't do you any good when somebody else's protocols have failed them and you rely on that third party.
Yeah, because we're all connected in some way, shape, or form.
Exactly.
I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and we were challenged by one of the speakers to think the unthinkable. And one of the things that we thought it was essentially the power grid across the United States being subject to some kind of attack which wipes out power, basically. I mean, how beyond the realms of possibility is that?
It's not beyond at all. No. It's actually very realistic. It seems like something that's incredibly obscure. How would somebody ever find and hack into one of these power plants? Right. But most of these protocols that all of the computers that run all of that infrastructure, it was all designed in the 1970s, the 1980s, before the internet and information security was really a thing that anybody worried about. So there's plenty of vulnerability out there waiting to be exploited. But over the last decade or two, all of that stuff has now ended up connected to the internet. And there's search engines out there, sort of like Google for the internet-connected things, that you can just go in and start punching in like power plants, or maybe a specific make and model of some sort of industrial device controller that has a vulnerability in it. Punch that into the search engine, and it'll show you it just searches the internet all the time looking for these sorts of devices and just stores them like Google does, right? So you punch it into the search engine tells you, okay, here's every instance of this particular vulnerable device that we've found, and now you can just go down the list and start breaking into them.
It's fascinating and scary kind of all at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah.
I want to bring this to procurement, and when I think about some of the high-profile data security breaches, for example, that we've heard about the last year or two, a lot of them are connected to third parties. So it's been a vulnerability at a supplier, whether it's a credit card processor or whatever it may be, but it's something that's not necessarily controlled. It's something that was outsourced, and the company thought, I've outsourced it, I don't have to worry about that. How, as a procurement group, it's really two questions. I want to talk about being proactive and being reactive. But first of all, how can we be proactive to mitigate as much of that risk as possible?
It comes down to contracts. Again, there's nothing really from a technology perspective that you can do on your own. If you're giving data to that third party, now you have to rely on that third party. So it comes down to contractual obligations. You have to spell out exactly what you want them to do to protect that data, whether that's encrypting it or keeping things offline, and making sure that there's a very, very clear set of requirements. Because what we've seen right now is, sure, they kind of put something in the contracts that says you will secure this data.
There's a data security policy, and that's the extent of it.
Yeah, they don't get into sort of the necessary detail. And that's what we really need, is that sort of in detail, here's what you must do to protect our data, and consequences. What happens if that data is not protected? The reality of this is that most individuals, if you're talking about a sort of consumer data breach, the individuals don't know or care what third party's fault it actually was. We saw this a while back with T-Mobile, the quote-unquote T-Mobile breach, which had nothing to do with T-Mobile, really. It was the third party that got breached. But it was T-Mobile subscriber data that got stolen, so it goes down in the news as
brand reputational risk.
So the headlines said T-Mobile data stolen. That's what people read. So you can't just sort of consider outsourcing and giving your data away as, you wash your hands of it and you're no longer responsible for the data. You have to recognize that the consumers don't care that you've outsourced it. It was still your data to begin with, and they ultimately believe that you're responsible for it.
And do you find that mostly it's the IT business partners who help build those kind of that kind of language, or can assist you as a procurement professional in knowing what's right and what is relevant to put in an agreement like that? Because I don't think it's something a procurement person can necessarily know themselves, but they got to know the right people to loop in so that those considerations have been made when you put the contracts in place. You're
spot on. You're going down the right road, that it's, procurement executives, we wouldn't expect them to know all of the details of what should and shouldn't be encrypted. But even IT, they don't necessarily know that. And the right people to get involved are, number one, what we call an information owner. So this would be sort of a manager somewhere down in the trenches that let's say we've got a system that's taking credit card numbers.
Yeah.
This would be the manager that is in charge of the process that uses those credit card numbers or whatever customer information that happens to be in there, sensitive personal documents, medical records, whatever it happens to be. You find that person and say, okay, what's in this system? What are we sending out? What's it worth? And then you have to start getting legal involved. What are our compliance requirements around this? So something like credit cards, you get into PCI compliance, medical records, you get HIPAA. So you need the legal team to come in and explain, here's what our actual
regulatory responsibilities are.
And that's something that the IT team won't know.
Yeah.
And then where the IT team gets involved is once you've got this complete picture of what the regulatory environment looks like, and you've got a requirement from PCI that says all data must be encrypted, now you can get your IT personnel in to say, okay, this data must be encrypted. How are we going to do that? What should the actual requirement to the third party look like? And so it's very much a team effort.
Right. So a breach happens. Unfortunately, with all the best will in the world, there's a lot of things that are protected against that we probably don't know about, but sometimes things get through the cracks. How can we react, and how, as a procurement organization, can we help our businesses react when there's a breach with a third party?
So speed is key. And if we're talking third parties, again, it's contractual. And that's something going back to PCI in the credit card world. PCI's payment card industry, and they've got their data security standard that everybody who touches a credit card is supposed to adhere to. Somewhere buried in the fine print of the agreement, when your organization says they're going to start taking credit cards and they sign an agreement with some processing bank somewhere, and buried in the fine print is something that says that if your organization gets breached and credit cards get stolen, forensics teams are sent in from the credit card brands. And you have no say over that. You have to agree to that in the contract if you're going to take credit cards at all. If you don't like that, then don't take credit cards. And so that's what we've seen in the aftermath of some of these major breaches is you get these PCI forensics examiners come in and start tearing through the network, and now you can't really hide all of the lax security that you had in place. And so that's sort of the model that we should be looking at for if you're sharing your data with a third party. Maybe it's not credit card data, but something that's valuable to your organization. That number one, you've got the contractual requirements that they have to protect it, but that once a breach happens, you're not just relying on them to sort of do a full investigation and be honest about what
you take it out of their hands.
Exactly, you've got to, because of course they're going to be worried about liability. Their lawyers are going to be telling them to share the bare minimum that they possibly can.
This is the story.
And you need to protect yourself from that. You need to be able to go in there and get a complete picture of what was stolen. Because the worst thing that we see happen in the aftermath of these breaches, and we're seeing it right now with Equifax, and I believe some of the stuff coming out of the SEC as well, is that you get that sort of initial report of, oh, there was a breach and this many records were stolen. And then a week later you find out, oh, and now this many more records were stolen. And then a week later it's, oh, and this other type of information that we didn't realize was stolen with those records was also stolen. And it keeps these things in the headlines. And it keeps consumers just going like, well, how incompetent were you?
Right.
Not only did you fail to protect,
you didn't know what was taken.
But you didn't even know what was taken.
And you had a long time to figure it out, and you kept finding new data that was taken.
Exactly. So speed is key there. Having those agreements in place so that you can send your team in to figure out what's going on, and do it quickly without dealing with the lawyers and all that.
How can we help lead or support the determination of how prepared a supplier actually is? We go through, maybe the contract is in place, we've got some great language in place, everybody signs up, and maybe there's an assessment that's done at that time. Usually some huge Excel sheet, which who knows how relevant that is for an assessment anyway. But let's say everybody's happy. How do you actually test? And what role can procurement play? Is that part of a governance process, or to make sure that everything stays as it was when you, and that they have the ability to react in the way that they say they will?
It depends, again, kind of on that regulatory environment. That if you get something like PCI, if we're dealing with credit card data, PCI does have this sort of very robust testing methodology that an organization will be able to go out and say, yes, we are PCI compliant.
Yeah.
And you go on the website, you verify that they're on there. They'll be able to give you this sort of little brief executive summary that says that, yes, an assessor came in 6 months ago and checked this, that, and the other thing. And you know that they're doing these quarterly vulnerability scans, they're doing these annual penetration tests, or something like that.
It's all third-party audited.
Yep. So you're in very good shape there. But if we go outside that regulatory realm where you just have sort of your business, let's say intellectual property, trade secrets, that sort of thing, that for whatever reason, maybe you're putting it in the cloud, you're transferring them to a third party who's going to manufacture whatever widgets it is that you've designed, and you want to make sure that your competitor doesn't sort of hack into this manufacturing facility and steal all of your trade secrets, your blueprints. Now you're completely outside that regulatory realm. You're on your own. And you have to sort of make up your own protocol. And so a lot of those same tools that we see in the PCI space, like penetration testing is a huge one. Basically, you're hiring good guy hackers to pretend that they're bad guy hackers and try to break in. And you don't want to just do that when you first sign that contract. I mean, you absolutely do want to.
Yeah.
You want to do it actually before you sign the contract. You want to make sure that you're not getting some fly-by-night organization that's completely not prepared for what you're going to be sending them. So make that part of the procurement process, is that before we sign any deals with anyone, we want to have a qualified third-party penetration testing team go in and start trying to poke holes in their system. And if they pass that, okay, great, we sign the contract. But in that contract, on an ongoing basis, say once a year, we're going to do ongoing tests. And if you get an organization that looks at that and runs away screaming, well, you should probably run away in the other direction too, and look at another option.
Interesting, and it's kind of a different world. You know, I've never, and maybe that's just the things that I bought, but I've never even thought about going and using third parties to go and do that kind of vulnerability testing and essentially getting a hacker to try and find the things that you don't want another hacker to find before they find it. It's fascinating.
And the thing about that is it's very much skills-based. That you don't necessarily want to rely on that other organization saying, oh, yeah, we totally did a penetration test and nobody was able to break in. Here's the results. We are NTT Security's penetration testing team. We sort of had a bad habit for years of we'd go into organizations that, oh yeah, we've been doing penetration tests for years. They always come back clean. And then our team would go in and just tear the place apart. And it turned out that some people are saying they're doing penetration tests when really they're just firing up one of these little automated scan tools and clicking the button. And if the scan tool doesn't come back with anything, then they call it good. And so that's sort of a problem in the security industry, is the language isn't always the same. What one person calls a penetration test may not be the same as what another person calls it. So that's where having your own qualified third party that you know their skills and their capabilities becomes key.
Is there a sense of kind of people putting their head in the sand?
Absolutely.
Thinking that one is it's not going to happen to us, or it can happen to us, but also I don't want there to be vulnerabilities because that creates a whole load more problems in terms of my infrastructure. Yep.
I've seen a lot of sort of IT teams that there's friction between the IT personnel and the security personnel and the executives. You've got an IT team that's saying, we don't have the budget, we know we've got problems, we know we have vulnerabilities, we need to fix them. And the executives just kind of ignore them because that doesn't fit in whatever budget they need for this year to meet whatever targets that they've set out. And so sometimes we would get brought in to do these penetration tests by the IT team, hoping that when we just tear the network apart, and sometimes they'll even be telling us, they'll be like, hey, why don't you look over in this dusty corner over here? And the IT personnel are trying to show us all of the terrible, terrible stuff on their network so that we can go turn around and tell the executives, we broke into your network in 5.5 minutes, and so could any 12th grader in his parents' basement with too much time on his hands. And so quite a bit of that. Sometimes we get the opposite problem where you've got IT personnel that maybe have been there for a long, long time. They think they know everything. they're just entrenched, and they haven't kept up on new security threats. And you get a new executive, maybe a new CSO comes in, and this new CSO has the mandate to make sure we don't get hacked. And so now you've got a CSO that's bringing in the testing team to go and try to break the network. And now you've got sort of a hostile IT team that every vulnerability you bring to them, they say, no, that's not really a threat because reasons. And we know better. We find these holes all the time. We know which holes are being used to actively break into companies. So you get into this sort of fight where you have to prove that every single vulnerability is really a threat to the organization. And so we get it both ways.
Well, everybody's setting up lunch around us, all the background noise you can hear. So what I want to do is I have one last question before we wrap up. I always hear when I talk about risk to people that this can't happen to me. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned it already a couple of times in our conversation, so I'm sure it's a conversation you always have of, I'm not vulnerable because of X, Y, and Z. What are some of the unexpected or strange places where risks have occurred where, and if it ties back to third parties, particularly where people have just thought, I'm good, I don't need to worry about this. How can that even be a risk factor to me where risk has occurred? Because I want to make sure that we kind of reiterate that risk really does happen and cybersecurity risk happens all around you. It's something to really take seriously.
Third party is a huge piece of it. We saw that years ago with the Target breach, that was, somebody broke into one of their contractors, then from the contractor were able to move into the Target network. So that happens all the time. And you get sort of the where information security or sort of network security meets with physical security, meets with those processes that I mentioned earlier, that you'll get things where maybe your network is all locked down and firewalled off from the internet, but if I can walk into the lobby of your building and plug into a network jack or sit in the parking lot on your Wi-Fi, what's the point of all those firewalls protecting you from the internet? So there's sort of that backdoor approach to getting into the network, phishing people, calling people on the phone and convincing them to give out passwords, all different ways of getting into the network that don't involve hacking in directly over the internet.
They require your teams to be complicit in some way, albeit unwittingly complicit. It's fascinating. Well, I really thank you for joining me, Chris. What I'm going to do is I'll just link to your profile on LinkedIn if listeners would like to learn a little bit more. Also to NPP and the website, so that again listeners can educate themselves a little bit more on cybersecurity and threat intelligence specifically. I'll put those all at our show notes. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/NTT. And Chris, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.